welcome on behalf of Ideas for India to this second Ashok Kotwal Memorial Lecture to be delivered by Professor Pranab Bardhan. And his lecture has the title Inequality, Labor, and Social Democracy. Let me say a few words about Ashok and our speaker for today. Ashok Kotwal was the founding editor of Ideas for India. He is really instrumental in building this online portal for the dissemination of ideas about Indian economic policymaking to a wider audience beyond the sort of narrow world of academics speaking a highly technical language. So Ashok himself was one of the sort of pioneering contributions to the field of development economics. He has classic papers from the 80s, 90s, which gave us a lot of insight about the peculiar institutions and markets of developing countries and the challenges that they throw up for policymakers. In the last 10 years of his life, Ashok took up this passion to create this portal because he firmly believed that academic endeavor, if it's to be meaningful, shouldn't be just restricted to the ivory tower. Academics need to kind of reach out to non-academics and to sort of explain their ideas in simpler language and also sort of gain from the experience of people working on the ground. Last year, the lecture was delivered by Professor Debraj Ray. This year, we have an equally eminent speaker, Professor Pranab Bardhan from the University of Berkeley. I cannot give you a complete and comprehensive account of the numerous accomplishments of Professor Bardhan, so I'll just give you some random sampling. He was educated in Presidency College, Calcutta University, and the University of Cambridge. He has been in faculty positions in some of the leading universities in India as well as abroad. He has taught in Calcutta University, in MIT, in the Indian Statistical Institute, in my own home institution, Delhi School of Economics, and since 1977, he has been a professor at the University of Berkeley, and he has also held visiting positions in universities of Cambridge and Oxford and University of Siena. He has numerous honors. I won't give you a detailed list. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow, the winner of the Mahalanobis Medal, and many other awards. He has been on the editorial board of some of the leading journals in our profession, like the American Economic Review, the Journal of Economic Perspectives, and he was most well known as the editor of the Journal of Development Economics, which is a leading field journal in development economics. So he has left his stamp on the field, not only with his own prolific research output, but also as a guide to the profession in his capacity as the editor. He has more than 150 journal articles, many books. I was looking at his profile on various web pages. There seems to be no reliable point estimate of the number of books he has written. I think it is a mean of about 15 and a standard deviation of 2 or 3 from the various websites that I saw. So I can probably clarify how many he has written. Just to mention a couple of titles, his book, A World of Insecurity, Democratic Disenchantment in Rich and Poor Countries, was published by Harvard University Press last year. And today evening, there's a book launch event, so those of you who are interested are invited to attend. He has a new book, which is a memoir called Choraivati, An Academic's Global Journeys, published by HarperCollins. So that event is coming up later in the evening. Professor Bardhan's contributions range across various areas of development economics, which includes rural markets and institutions, political economy and governance, globalization and decentralization, and so on. And he also has a bunch of very interesting papers on a comparison of the economic trajectories of the two major emerging economies, India and China. So today he'll talk about inequality, labor, and social democracy. So this, broadly speaking, relates to some of the disturbing trends that we have seen emerge across the world in the last few decades, which is rising inequality in many countries, especially the most prosperous economies like the USA, and the fallout of that, especially in the political domain, which is rise of illiberal democracies, elected authoritarianism, certain kind of political forces like xenophobia or jingoism kind of being on the rise and being more dominant forces in politics all over the world. Even recently, you've seen some election outcomes in countries as disparate as Argentina and Holland. And so these are trends which we are well aware of, and there's a general feeling out there that many of the economic forces which has shaped the world in the last 20, 30, or 40 years, which has given rise to labor losing a lot of its power, the non-college educated sections of the working class in richer countries falling behind, and that has triggered a lot of sentiments. So, and of course, to top it all, there's the recent talk about artificial intelligence, so that's another Pandora's box which is being opened up. So all these challenges require us to think on a broader scale, go beyond our narrow technocratic model building or econometrics and talk comprehensively about the landscape that is evolving all around us. And Professor Bardhan has contributed greatly to this dialogue. He also writes in popular outlets like Project Syndicate and Indian newspapers like Indian Express and so on. So he has been a prominent public intellectual and a contributor to the debate about how to tackle the challenges created by globalization, automation, and so on, and about possible sort of out-of-the-box policy solutions like universal basic income. Lastly, on a personal note, let me say that Professor Bardhan has taught many generations of students. I've never been a direct student of his, but when I was first studying economics in Presidency College and at the Delhi School of Economics, many of his articles, especially the policy articles in the Economic and Political Weekly, were inspirational. They were analytical, careful, insightful, but also carried a certain passion, for want of a better word, and also gave the sense that discussing matters of public policy is important and can be lively and engaging. So in some sense, vicariously, he has been a teacher of mine too. So I thank him for that. With that, without much further ado, let me ask Professor Bardhan to deliver his lecture. He'll speak for about 40 to 50 minutes, and after that, we'll have a question-answer session, which I will moderate. Professor Bardhan.
Thank you, Parikshit, for those over-generous remarks. Thanks to the organizers of this lecture for giving me this opportunity to address you. And thank you all for coming to listen to me this Friday afternoon. I'm going to start with talking about the person in whose memory this lecture is. I have given many memorial lectures in my long years, but it's particularly heart-wrenching to give a memorial lecture for somebody who is younger than me. Most of the other lectures that I've given for senior people. I've known Ashok since middle 1980s. It so happens that around that time, he and I were interested in similar kinds of issues, primarily agrarian institutions. I was doing both theoretical and empirical work on agrarian institution. Ashok was doing primarily on theory, but we used to interact quite often on agrarian institutions. In fact, I remember in 1989, I edited a book called The Economic Theory of Agrarian Institutions for Clarendon Press, Oxford. And I invited Ashok to contribute. He and Eswaran contributed a chapter in that edited book of mine. And in all that long period which Parikshit referred to of my editorship of the Journal of Development Economics, I was the editor for about 18 years. In those 18 years, I have not counted, but I think Ashok published in JDE, that journal, quite a few of his very well-known articles, primarily on agrarian institutions in that journal. And since he and I been in the same time zone in the world, I in Berkeley and he being in Vancouver, we used to talk quite often on the phone. In fact, he once called me and said, "Do you mind if I call you and something comes to my mind, I want to discuss with you?" I said, "No, go ahead." So he would often call me and we'd discuss. First, we'd talk about India, and then we'd talk about more general political economy issues which interested us both. And then toward the last phase of his life, he would sometimes call me and say that, "Do you mind if I call you early in the afternoon? Because with the chemotherapy, I fade away by late afternoon." So he used to call me quite often early afternoons, and we'll start with my inquiring about his health. Then we'll talk about our despair about some things going on in India. And then we'll talk about many ideas that he started thinking about, and in general, political economy issues. And I think one of his last things that I did for him, I have written often for Ideas for India, but one of the last things was a video of a conversation between Ashok and me in Ideas for India on political ideology. That, I think, if I remember right, Parikshit was there in that conversation. So in a sense, I feel that my lecture today is a continuation of my conversation with Ashok. Only thing, I will not benefit from his inputs. But I think he would be interested in the topic that I'm going to talk about. And we have talked about a little bit about these things in the past. So my topic is inequality, labor, and social democracy. Let me start with inequality. Much of the time in both economic and in the general media, the discussion has often taken the form of the top 1% versus the 99%. You might remember this was the slogan of the Occupy movement. And my friend Thomas Piketty has gone to town on this, and they now publish data on the top 1% income share in their World Inequality Report that Piketty brings out. Less often is discussed the more widely prevalent decline in labor share over the last 3 decades or so. In fact, I once looked at the data for labor share. There was an IMF report, I forget which year, but recently, which gave the labor share data for many countries, both rich and poor and developing countries. And it was quite remarkable that if you try to find out countries where the top 1% income share has gone up, and look at countries where labor share has declined, actually more countries, its labor share decline rather than the increase in the top 1%, particularly in OECD countries. Let me give you an example. Netherlands. Netherlands, the top 1% of income share is more or less stable for many decades, but labor share has been declining. So I think the labor capital distribution, one doesn't pay as much attention to, is actually the inequality in that sense may be more prevalent. And of course, there are many reasons for it. Obvious reasons are like labor-saving technology and globalization. I'm going to come back to globalization. But what I'm going to emphasize today is that the main institutional or organizational factor facilitating this is the systematic weakening over time in labor organizations. I mentioned Netherlands. Even in Netherlands, trade union density figures, if you check, has gone down, even though top 1% share has remained more or less the same. So I'm going to talk about the state of trade unions and their role. Trade unions, losing existing members and unable to attract sufficient numbers of new ones, now have their back to the wall. But more than that, the factor that's been working, and I'm going to talk about now some factors about the decline of trade unions, and this is all over the world. Persistent, well-funded campaigns by business interests against unions and their capture and use of media to this effect have resulted in the shrinking of organized workers' traditional rights and domain. Employers in both US and India are in general more anti-union than, say, in Europe. We see this from the strike-breaking so-called right-to-work movement pushed by employers in the American Rust Belt. That's one extreme. Two, large numbers of contract laborers without benefits working side by side with regular workers in factories in India, sometimes on very similar kinds of work. What this kind of thing ignores, businessmen who want this ignore that sometimes when they face labor problems, they regard unions as a problem, but they don't consider that some of the labor problems they face are preventable if active unions were there. Consider the recent case. I could give you many such examples, but I'll just give you one example. Consider the recent case of worker unrest taking a violent turn in December 2020 in Wistron's iPhone assembly factory near Bangalore. This was a factory that employed about, and look at the numbers, regular employees number was 2,000, contract workers 7,000. So the ratio, people think contract labor is just a small number. No. In this case, they were the dominant force, contract workers without benefits. There was no labor union. So union was not the problem. And I'm saying union could have been partial solutions. Grievances that inflamed many workers included inordinately delayed payments of wages and an extension of the workday to 12 hours without much notice or consultation. In fact, since then, several states in India have now officially introduced 12-hour workdays. Let me digress a little because I'm reminded of the discussion more than 150 years back in economics literature on the 12-hour workday. And the person I'm thinking of is Karl Marx. If you read Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1, there's quite a bit of discussion on 12-hour workday because he was writing in the context of the Factory Act in Britain. And in the Factory Act, they were reducing the number of hours from 12 and above to 8. And businessmen were hostile to the introduction, businessmen in Britain were hostile to the introduction of Factory Act. And Marx was writing in that context. And I remember reading, I'm just from my vague memory, Marx says, think of even the illiterate peasants. The peasants, the farmers, know very well that if they want to keep up the fertility of the soil in agriculture, they have to keep some of the land fallow. That ultimately helps the fertility of the soil. Similarly, even in industries, if you get workers to squeeze the maximum out of workers, ultimately it's going to hurt you because labor productivity will decline. This is what Marx writes in quite a few pages. And then at the end, he says that sometimes, and I'm going to use that expression a little later also, he says, sometimes capitalists need to be, by that he means myopic capitalists, capitalism needs to be protected from these myopic capitalists. The exact expression he uses is the werewolf hunger for profits. That's the expression he uses. That capitalism needs to be protected from that. But we, and this is middle 19th century, today, in the 21st century, third decade, we are now officially in some states introducing 12-hour workdays. In addition, in India in recent years, there's also been a substantial dilution, if not outright gutting, of workplace safety regulations. And many attribute the recent rise in industrial accidents to this wanton deregulation. And these accidents, if they happen in a big way, hurt both labor and capital. And this is what capitalism needs to be protected against myopic capitalists who go and support this wanton deregulation. Other factors, thinking of other factors behind the declining strength of labor organizations, in rich countries, informal organized labor is growing. In rich countries, informal unorganized labor is growing, and you know about the gig workers, etc. So the proportion of informal workers in rich countries is increasing. And of course, in poor countries, the number of workers in the traditional informal sector far exceeds those of the formal sector. Most of you know the numbers. For example, the latest report that I saw, periodic labor survey in India, 2017-18, for the full year national sample survey, if I remember right, even in the non-agricultural sector, 3/4 of the labor force in the non-agriculture sector informal. So there is a great deal of labor fragmentation, which makes labor movements weak. And I count some forms of this labor fragmentation by skill. So let me mention a little bit on this. It's not just unskilled workers, skilled workers, but I think over time, with the spread of the knowledge economy, the gulf between the professional and knowledge workers, and in general, a whole sections of white-collar workers and the blue-collar workers, the manual employees, the gulf is increasing in various ways. And that is being reflected in politics, by the way. Even in and this is happening in all countries, but it's quite prominent in countries like the United States. And this is being reflected in the voting pattern in elections. Let me cite you one very striking factoid in electoral politics in the United States. Today, it's largely because of this gap between skilled and unskilled workers. Today, if you take the poorest 10 districts of the United States, they largely vote for the Republican Party. If you take the richest 10 districts in the United States, they largely vote for the Democratic Party. This has partly become the paradoxical political impact of this division, the great divide between different types of workers. Then, of course, by gender, and in India, it particularly takes from their wage and other labor practices are quite often are against women. But more than that, India, as you know, is one of the world's lowest participation. It's of both men and women, but particularly of women in the world. So in a sense, the labor fragmentation takes an extreme form in gender terms in India. Third is by production sector, and what I mean is that trade unions used to be very strong, largely in manufacturing and transportation. As the economy goes more towards the service sectors, unions are not, as a union movement, labor movement gets weaker. I'm going to talk about some exceptions to this in a minute, but that's what I have in mind when I say labor fragmentation by production sector. Then by organizational unit, and what I have in mind is that some countries in Europe organize their labor sectorally, for the whole industry, say, not by farm. But the United States and India, the labor movement is much more decentralized. As a result, the employers are anti-union at the farm level, whereas where labor organizations at the industry level or sectoral level, at the farm level, you don't see that hostility, the anti-union hostility as much. This is true in Europe, large parts of Europe, it is the sectoral. In Scandinavian countries, it's even more centralized because the confederates of labor are much more important. But even in France and other European countries, Western European countries, the organizational unit is sectoral. Then there is also this, what is called the Ghent system. Ghent, as you know, is a city in Belgium. The Ghent system, because that's where it started, but then it spread out to other European cities. The Ghent system, if you don't know about it, is where the welfare benefits are administered by the trade unions. So that gives the trade unions a stake, and the labor becomes much more attached to the trade unions because the welfare administration is done by the trade through the trade unions. But most countries, certainly not India or United States, have that. And then I've already commented upon the formality, informality of the issue of the labor fragmentation. I mentioned here including self-employment. By the way, I should have mentioned it before. When I talked about labor share data for different parts of the world, labor share declining, there is one footnote to that. There are other footnotes, but let me mention one, is that for countries like ours, it's difficult to know what exactly they mean by labor share. Because when you are a self-employed farmer, is your income due primarily to labor or to your land or to your capital? So there are various forms of imputation of labor income, etc. So there is a caveat to the labor share data for countries like India, where self-employment, I think the latest data in India in this periodic labor force survey, if I remember right, the self-employed is still about 60% of the workforce. So what is the labor share? Does it include farmers' income? No, it should not, because farmers' incomes partly due to land, etc. So there is a problem there. Moving on, what I want to mention here is that therefore we have to think about bridging this gulf, this labor fragmentation. If you want to strengthen labor movements, you have to think about bridging these various divided parts of the labor system. So I could give you many other examples, but I've given here 5 examples of common platforms for labor, both formal and informal. Universal access to vocational training programs and active labor market policies. This will help both formal labor and informal labor. And if it does, then it could be a common demand of all laborers, not just the organized sector. And that will strengthen the labor movement. So think of platforms which will unite all sections of labor. Otherwise, at the moment, our trade unions represent only a very tiny, tiny fraction of all the workers. So when they demand higher wages, it doesn't resonate with the others. Particularly if you are self-employed in the villages, then why do you care where the public sector employees are asking for higher wages? Because it doesn't affect you. You are a self-employed farmer, you are much more than the wage demand, you are maybe much more interested in better credit facilities, marketing facilities. If you are a woman, you maybe care a lot about the child care facilities and things like that. So for the self-employed, their demands may be quite different. Yet our trade unions don't even think about this. So vocational training is one of these, and childcare I mentioned, this is the third one, universal access to childcare. Similarly, for this gender cause of labor fragmentation, universal access to community kitchen. Of course, as you know, this was started in India, particularly in South India. We still have some Indira kitchens, in Jayalalitha's time, Amma kitchens and so on. So those are makes a big difference to the woman workers' participation. So we have to think about, essentially going back, I'm saying, think about issues that can kind of bridge over this fragmentation. And by the way, I should have mentioned something about active labor market policies. What is active labor market policy? Active labor market policy is essentially when a labor worker loses a job, you support them in various ways. One, of course, in Europe, you get unemployment benefits. But more than that, the best country from active labor market policy is Denmark. So when Denmark, a worker loses job, the state carries out programs of training the worker for new skills, which will be in demand. The old skills are no longer in demand, you lose your job, but the state takes a responsibility, and the trade unions takes responsibility of training you in new jobs. That's part of the active labor market policies. As far as I know, Denmark's program is the best in the world. So this is something, so laborers, instead of agitating for job losses, sometimes job losses are inevitable because of the market fluctuations in market demand, etc. But it's neutralized by active labor market policies in social democratic countries like Denmark. And then, of course, universal healthcare. It really is quite elementary. Unfortunately, both the United States and India have gone the other way, not the universal healthcare way. Even Ayushman Bharat is far, far away from any universal healthcare. There are a lot of problems with Ayushman Bharat. Forget about countries like UK or countries like France, which have achieved universal healthcare. There are some developing countries which have achieved universal healthcare. Traditionally, one of the best examples used to be Costa Rica. But you don't have to go that far. One of our neighboring countries have achieved universal healthcare, that's Thailand. Thailand introduced about 20 years back, universal healthcare is working reasonably. So it is possible, even for developing countries, to carry out universal healthcare. And universal healthcare should have helped the business people as well. So, for example, countries that have universal health care gets the support of the business because when they, unlike in the United States, uh, when they are competing with another country in some marketing some products, they don't have to worry about, they have the advantage that they don't have to provide the job for the additional labor. They don't have to think about their healthcare because the state does healthcare. So businessmen don't have to. Unlike in United States, because in United States, if you're thinking of hiring an extra labor, the marginal cost of labor includes the healthcare cost of the whatever minimal healthcare that business pays you. So it's job related. So it hurts the labor hiring cost of business, which the Swedish employer doesn't have to worry about. So in that sense, Sweden has an advantage over United States because they have universal health care. This is an advantage not just for workers, it's an advantage for business. And yet, anybody talks about universal health care in the United States or India, much of the time, business people are hostile to universal health care. Let me now spend a couple of minutes on, I think Parikshit already referred to my work on universal basic income. What I want to emphasize is not what it is. I think most of you know what universal basic income is. But I want to point out something which is neglected in India on the issue of universal basic income. And that, let me tell you, when I first wrote about it. In fact, I gave a lecture in Delhi in November, exactly this month, November 2010, in Nehru Museum. There is a large gathering of economists and other policymakers at that time. And this gathering was looking at issues of social democracy. And in my lecture, I said one form of social democracy none of you are considering is universal basic income. But much of the time, being it's a gathering of economists, much of the time I spent in how to fund it. So we talked about getting it, redirecting the current subsidies to the better of farmers, better of people, and then redirecting some of the what used to be called revenues foregone, which are mainly various kinds of tax exemptions, and then adding some extra taxes. I have made in my this other book that Parikshit referred to, World of Insecurity, there's a chapter on universal basic income. I'm not recommending it for rich countries. It's much too expensive for rich countries. But I have done back of the envelope calculations to show that if you do those things, redirect subsidies, redirect what is called revenues foregone or tax exemptions, and some measure of additional taxation, you can collect in India about 10% of GDP. If you want to see the calculations, it's a chapter in my book, World of Insecurity. If you get 10% of GDP, then I say universal basic income is not the only claim. So I say follow a rough formula. Give 1/4 of 10% of GDP that you can collect this way potentially to health, 1/4 to education, 1/4 to infrastructure, and the remaining 1/4 to universal basic income. And the way, in fact, by the way, after my November 2010 lecture, I published in EPW, March 2011. And again, it's an article on social democracy. And why am I emphasizing it? I've seen that at that time when I gave that lecture, most of the audiences thought it was a weird idea. Nobody's, in India at least, even though it's a very old idea in Europe, nobody given much thought to universal basic income in India. Most of the people's reaction was, this is strange, and all utopian. But later, a lot of people took up the idea of universal basic income in India, but I think it's the wrong context. Somehow, in the subsequent discussion, was in terms of how best to help the poor. That was not my purpose originally. My purpose was going back, how to bridge the formal labor with informal labor. Because if you have universal basic income, it's going to help everybody. So, large numbers of informal workers who are not otherwise interested in the trade union movement in India will become interested if universal basic income is a basic demand of trade unions. So I looked at it as one way of strengthening social democracy, because it helps you in bridging over that fragmentation that I was talking about. But somehow the discussion has been hijacked into how to help the poor. Is this the best way of helping the poor? Of course, it may not be the best. If you are thinking of helping the poor, universal basic income is one possible way, but this may not be the most cost-effective way, because as you know, there are inclusion errors, there are exclusion errors. Universal basic income, there are very little exclusion errors, but there are large inclusion errors. So helping the poor, this may or may not be the best policy. But that was not the perspective in which I originally wrote. But everybody ignores that aspect, but I look at it as from the point of view of the labor movement, reducing the fragmentation of labor movement. And this universality, I've given you 5 examples of universal programs that will strengthen labor movement. This universality of benefit as a right to every citizen, and also a way of reducing political clientelism and reducing what we have today, welfare policies as gifts of political leaders. We sometimes, with the photograph of the political leaders, whether at the central level or at the state level. Now, let me give you some attempts that are going on in much of the rest of the world about this bridging the fragmentation that I talked about. So, for example, SEIU in US and Canada is now a very large union for this sectoral fragmentation that I talked about. That trade unions used to be stronger in manufacturing and transportation. Now, SEIU is a large union for service workers. Unite, one of the largest unions in UK and Ireland, are in services, construction, as well as manufacturing and transportation. So we are extending this domain, which is strengthening the labor movement. Germany's IG Metall, Europe's largest industrial union, now opening up for self-employed workers. The Independent Workers' Union of Great Britain trying to reach out to gig workers. And of course, in India, the largest informal workers' union is SEBA, Self-Employed Women's Association. And it's very interesting that they don't concentrate, even though they call themselves a trade union, their main demands are not wage demands. Their main demands are various kinds of insurance, credit, marketing, etc. Because that's what are the main problems for many of these self-employed informal workers. During the pandemic, the Indian Federation of App-Based Transport Workers organized drivers of ride-hailing apps and delivery workers. This just to give some example, attempts are now being made all over the world to help these other kinds of workers, not the traditional clientele of labor organizations. Let me also make a digression here. We economists usually think of trade unions as mainly as an economic organization. In my book, World of Insecurity, I have emphasized another aspect of trade unions, a cultural role, if you like. In fact, my title of my book, World of Insecurity, a large part of my book is not just on economic insecurity. I talk about cultural insecurity. Trade unions are not just institutions for wage bargaining or improvement of work conditions. They also act as a cultural anchor of shared identity, solidarity, and pride in work. They used to tame and transcend parochial, sectarian, or ethnic passions. With their weakening, there is a cultural void filled in by various kinds of populist demagogues. So trade union decline has also meant a void in the cultural sphere, which of course economists don't usually talk about. That was just a digression. I'll move back to economic issues. And that has to do with financial globalization, how it weakens labor bargaining power. I think there is a case for restrictions on international movement of capital. Usually the case that is made against international movement of capital is from the point of view of financial stability, because free flows of capital quite often cause these financial instability problems. But I think there's an extra reason. If you look at it from a labor point of view, there's an extra reason for restriction on international movement of capital. Why? For the simple reason that with financial globalization, capital can do a credible threat which labor cannot. Capital can always say, well, if you don't accept our deal, we're going to move elsewhere. Labor cannot easily do that. So there is a basic asymmetry. When there is financial globalization, there is basic asymmetry in the power of capital and labor. But see, this factor alone, one can make a credible threat to move elsewhere, the labor cannot. And that is one of the fundamental reasons for the weakening of labor all over the world. Another factor in the weakening of labor is increasing capital corporate concentration. Some data, the weighted average market share of the top 4 firms across all industries in the United States was 32% in 2017. In the decade leading up to 2019, the 5 largest tech firms, where the corporate concentration is even more than the general economy, they made over 400 acquisitions, usually of new entrants that might grow to be potential rivals. Many of you know examples. Simple example, Facebook acquired WhatsApp and acquired Instagram essentially to stop potential rivals. So they essentially increase their monopoly power. So here, let me pause for a minute, because this is something extremely important. Quite often, when the leftists talk about labor, improving labor power, etc., immediate retort is that, oh, you don't care about innovations, because that's the strength of capitalism. It gives you dynamic innovations, and you then cite Schumpeter, creative destruction, etc. But when Facebook acquires WhatsApp and Instagram, that's not creative destruction. I call it muscular entrenchment. And if somebody reads Schumpeter carefully, let me mention this, and I call it evolution in Schumpeter's thinking. So let me pause for a minute and talk about Schumpeter. So Joseph Schumpeter, when he was in Austria, in 1911, published a book, I still have a copy of that book, called The Theory of Economic Development. In that book, he talked about creative destruction. He said, this is the major source of dynamism of capitalism. New firms come and challenge the incumbent firm and defeat, quite often, not always, quite often defeat them, and that's how capitalism provides progress. This is in 1911, Schumpeter, 2011, where he first used that expression, creative destruction. Move 30 years from then, another of Schumpeter's classic work titled Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. Date of publication, he was at that time teaching at Harvard, I think it's 1942. Schumpeter has changed. He no longer believes capitalism does this, that new farms come up and challenge the incumbent farm and leads to innovations. By the time he's realized, and being in the United States, he's probably seen many such cases, quite often the incumbent farms gobbles up the potential rivals. Not always. I'm not suggesting this is the only thing that happens, but quite often they do. And Schumpeter revised his view, which quite often you will not find this mentioned in the literature. Schumpeter, creative destruction, dynamism of capitalism is the story you will get. But there are changes, even in Schumpeter's thinking. Data for India, there are some other sources. Let me cite just one. Viral Acharya's recent work, I think it's in the Brookings papers, has estimated that in the period 2016 to 21, the concentration, particularly in the top business groups, 5 business groups, I think, if I remember right, Acharya's article, it's of course Tata, Birla, Adani, Ambani, and Sunil Mittal. Top 5 business groups in India has increased sharply, largely through mergers and acquisition, not through dynamism, not through productivity improvement, but through mergers and acquisitions, essentially gathering monopoly power. These 5 big conglomerates are in over 40 NIC, National Industrial Classification, 2-digit sectors covering much of the non-financial corporate India. Now let me talk about a side effect of this, but to me it's a very important effect from the labor's point of view. This corporate concentration creates labor market monopsony. Usually, even when one discusses corporate concentration, one thinks of equity and efficiency. But there's also a labor market side to it, because the more concentrated capital is, the more concentrated is the hiring of labor, so there's more exploitation of labor. From labor's point of view, corporate concentration is a source of gigantic monopsony in the labor market. Monopsony, for the non-economists, is monopoly in the hiring of labor. In developing countries, this monopsony is exacerbated by geographic segmentation of labor markets. So, because the segmentation, geographic, there is localized monopsony. That's all over India. Of course, improvement happens in physical infrastructure can relieve some of this. Until recently, very little work on the effects of labor market monopsony in India, particularly in the non-farm sector. Many, many years back, in the 1970s and 1980s, I was carrying out quite a few village surveys in West Bengal with Ashok Rudra in a random sample of 110 villages in West Bengal, which showed a great deal of observational evidence of rural labor market fragmentation. And I published, this is in several journal articles, but in my book, Land, Labor and Rural Poverty, this evidence is mentioned. Through various degrees, this labor market fragmentation in India, rural India, is through various degrees of labor time by employers using interlinked relations with employees in concomitant credit and land tenancy relations. More recently, in fact this year, I think it's a paper in Econometrica by Muralidharan and co-authors, there is now experimental evidence that in undivided Andhra Pradesh, the NREGA program, by providing a minimum wage, weakened the monopsony power of landowners in the whole area. It's not just only minimum wage, improved the wage level of those who are working in NREGA, but the whole area got a boost up. Because of that, the monopsony power of landowners declined as because of NREGA. They found that this drove up market wages and employment all around. They found that the wage and employment gains were significantly higher in villages with higher land concentration. In other words, where with land concentration, there was more monopsony. In those areas, Enriga improved market wages and employment. This is also interesting. Quite often we think minimum wage reduces employment. But if you have monopsony, minimum wage can increase both wage and employment. That's because of the way monopsony works. So this is experimental evidence bearing out something that many decades back I got in my village survey work from observational evidence. Globally, for the United States, Naidu, Posner, and Naidu, by the way, Suresh Naidu is one of my best students in Berkeley. He's now a professor in Columbia. They estimate that employer monopsony power reduces labor share by 22%. In Peru, Amodio and co-authors estimate that in markets with high employer concentration, workers on average receive only 57% of the value of their marginal product of labor. For us economists, it's standard to say wage equal to marginal product of labor. Workers on average receive only 57% because of labor monopsony of the value of the marginal product of labor. Even in the United States, these authors estimate that labor on average receive only about 65% of the value of the marginal product of labor. So obviously antitrust policy, anti-monopoly policy is a remedy. And there I want to spend some time on a change in approach that's happening. The dominant view for a long time in the United States and elsewhere on antitrust policy was the dominant Chicago view. Chicago Law and Economics School was so influential in this. The idea is this. In anti-monopoly, all you have to look for is the consumer suffering. And look at the prices. So Google doesn't charge you any money for search. Therefore, Google is not a monopoly. Or you don't need an antitrust policy for Google. What people do not realize that Google, while giving this so-called free service, is actually extracting data from you and selling it to advertisers. As somebody said, when you get a product free, you are the product. They're selling you. This is what Google does. And Google is just one example. So you cannot just say, well, Google price is free, search is free, therefore no antitrust. That view used to be the dominant Chicago view. That is now being challenged. In fact, people now refer to Justice Brandeis in the US Supreme Court essentially argued against this long time back. Essentially said that no, consumer price is not the way to look at antitrust. You should take a larger view, and he called it you should involve all the stakeholders in deciding on antitrust. And of course, labor is an important stakeholder. Let me mention here what I call fallacy of Milton Friedman on this issue. Milton Friedman, in a very famous article, by the way, it's not a journal article, it came out in New York Times Magazine, but it's very, very influential in the business world and in the financial economics world. The idea is this. Milton Friedman said, suppose you want to help labor or you want to help some other social cause. Why should that interfere with shareholder profit maximization? Let the shareholders maximize profits, and then out of that maximized profits, if you want to donate to labor, donate to environment, donate to any social cause, you have more money. So you should focus, shareholders should focus on maximizing profits. Forget about the social causes for the time being, and then later you can donate much more to that cause. I think this is a fallacious argument. This is a very popular argument, by the way, in business world, to give a rationale for maximization of profits. The main counter-argument to Friedman is this. So in maximizing profits, if you structurally damage those social causes, and then help them out. That's not a solution. Environment is easy to example. If you damage the environment irreversibly and then you donate to an environment cause, it's not going to help. So Oliver Hart and Luigi Zingalis have an article on the non-separability of shareholder profit maximization and social causes, because the profit maximization itself may change the structural conditions and may cause irreversible damage. By the way, what I call the Friedman fallacy, this is also involved in another completely different area. There is a growing area of economics of philanthropy. Some philosophers have written on it. I think Peter Singer is the major philosopher. It's called effective altruism. And the idea is, again, suppose you are very philanthropic. You want to donate your money to good causes. This effective altruism theory, then you make as much money as you can get and then donate. So that way you can donate more. So again, maximize now and then donate. What again this philosophy ignores is that in the process of maximization itself, you may damage quite often irreversibly those causes that you want to help. So it's a very similar kind of counter argument either to Milton Friedman or to these philosophers and others who are now talking very loudly about effective altruism. Let me also mention that apart from antitrust, another way of reducing corporate concentration is substantial taxation of capital, like wealth tax, capital gains tax, inheritance taxes, as part of a social democratic program. Let me make a comment here on India. As you know, our wealth tax is zero, inheritance tax is zero, capital gains tax in India is very low, lower than in the United States. The standard argument I've heard fiscal bureaucrats over the years, fiscal bureaucrats in the North Bloc have told me, you people talk about wealth tax? Wealth tax didn't collect any money, it's not worth the administrative cost. My counter argument to them is this. You know why wealth tax did not, when it was on, or inheritance tax was abolished in the 1980s, it did not collect much money because the taxes as designed were riddled with loopholes. If you look at the wealth tax that was abolished in India, wealth tax laws, wealth tax exempts from taxation many forms of wealth. In fact, for all practical purposes, only unproductive forms of wealth were taxed. So it's like you riddle something with loopholes, then you cannot collect so much money and therefore it's not worth collecting, you abolish the tax. It's a wrong argument. In fact, let me give you references where there's a lot of work going on this. In the United States, actually some of the work is overviewed in a Journal of Economic Perspectives paper by Slemrod and a co-author in 2020 on new thinking on wealth taxes. How you can redesign the existing wealth taxes, which will collect a lot more money than they have so far. Even in Europe, which they have wealth taxes, and there are a lot of suggestions about improvement of wealth taxes where you can collect a lot of money. In UK, there is a taxation inquiry commission or substance change. They looked into wealth tax. I read the report on wealth taxation, the UK Tax Commission report. They've given a lot of examples how redesigning wealth taxes can collect a lot of money. Now, having said that, let me say, collecting revenue is not the only purpose of wealth tax. These kind of thing I'm talking about of reducing corporate concentration, wealth tax plays a role. And Piketty has given another argument. He said that another argument is simply informational. If you collect wealth taxes, you have a regular source of asset base of the economy, which then helps you in other taxation. So with the abolition of wealth taxes, you give up on a source of information that you need for other purposes, and so on. There is now a substantial literature, not unfortunately in India, much of it abroad, on this this redesigning. It's not the old, taxes are old, but redesigning these old taxes. Let me now comment on, I'm probably taking more time than I expected. I'll finish soon. Another aspect of social democrats' view on labor is labor should have a larger voice in the running of companies. Such labor voice can increase the say of workers in the firm's decision to outsource or relocate, get a seat for labor at the table of international negotiations on trade and investment rules. Currently, the corporate lobby and their expensive lawyers largely shape those rules. And the third thing that I mention here is going to be extremely important over time, because the R&D decisions in firms, unfortunately in India, even large private firms don't spend enough money on R&D. In R&D decisions need to be influenced by labor. Why? Otherwise, technological innovations will be labor-saving kind. So job situation will get worse. And of course, with artificial intelligence, it will be even worse. There's a new book by Asimoglu and Johnson called Power and Progress, that this will be very important in the new era of artificial intelligence, that labor has a voice in the which way R&D goes. Because otherwise, if you don't control it, if labor does not have any voice, it will go in general into reducing the role of labor. So it will be labor saving. Whereas it is possible. This book by Asimoglu and Johnson do talk about forms in which if time is not too late, you can still influence. If labor gets a voice, it will get influence the nature of innovations in the artificial intelligence. So what this means, that we have to worry not just about, when we say dynamism of capitalism, we have to worry not merely about the rate of innovation, we have to worry about the pattern of innovation. And that's where labor can play an important role. And the current focus is on the rate, where it's also important to shape the pattern of innovations. Already in strike action in the United States, unions are demanding a greater role in regulating artificial intelligence. Some of you may have read in the newspapers that Hollywood, there was a strike action, and Detroit, the United Auto Workers Union, just won a strike demand. And in both, who will regulate AI was an important issue. So workers are getting conscious of it. In the past, in the rollout of transformative technologies such as electricity, unions played a role in helping to shape new industrial systems to increase safety but also productivity. For example, in the United States, the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority project of the 1930s, was successful in large part because of the input from the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, which had developed in tandem with the new technology. Labor voice in corporate governance, as I already indicated, also can influence in other ways. So for example, one of the things that in the long run is subverting democracy all over the world is the funding of elections. And how you will fund elections at the moment is decided entirely by the corporate concentrated capital. If labor has a voice, then labor will get to also some influence in the funding of elections. In my book, World of Insecurity, there's a whole section on funding of elections. So I talk about successful countries of public funding of elections. Many of the social democratic countries have succeeded with public funding of elections. Scandinavian countries surely. In fact, in Sweden, they moved from corporate donation to essentially public funding of elections. But it's not just Scandinavian countries. In other countries, even in the North America, Canada has a successful public funding of elections. I think in the world today, the worst case of concentrated funding of elections are in the United States and India. The country for which we now have a great deal of empirical evidence on the effects of labor voice in corporate governance is Germany, where works councils, or more generally what is called co-determination or shared governance, is extremely important. In fact, until I studied this literature, I myself didn't know that in Germany how important this is. So if you take most large German companies, about 1/2 of the top governing bodies are represented of workers today. And as a result, women are much more represented in German corporate governing boards because they're worker representatives. So as a result, we now have a lot of data on Germany about what does labor voice in corporate governance does. There's large amounts of observational data on how this has positive effects on productivity, trustful industrial relations, and improvement in the channels of information flows between management and workers. In Japan, such collaboration between management and workers, called Kaizen, has been behind lean manufacturing innovations. So for example, you may have heard of the Toyota system of innovations, where essentially workers, while working, came up with new ideas, how to improve, how to avoid mistakes, and they passed on to the managers. So there is a collaboration between worker and management. And this also brings to something that often ignored in the literature of innovations, and that is, most of the time, because of that creative destruction tradition of innovations, we think of innovation primarily as those innovations which are disruptive, which disrupt, upend the existing incumbents. But that's not the only type of innovations. In large parts of the world, that is more the American type, but large parts of the world, the innovations are more incremental, not disruptive. So in Germany, in Japan, in South Korea, many of the innovations are the incremental kind. And this should not be ignored because incremental kind every year add up to a great deal of innovations. Oh, by the way, there's now some experimental data. One of my colleagues in Berkeley, Schofer, has written with his co-authors. They provide quasi-experimental evidence on positive effects of shared governance in Germany on productivity, without negative effects on profitability, raising of finance, or farm turnover. So social democracy, unlike democratic socialism, wants to use the innovative dynamism of capitalism, but at the same time tries to modify it in a labor and environmental friendly direction. By the way, I should mention a lot of people are confused on this distinction between social democracy and democratic socialism. Democratic socialism, since if you're a socialist, you want to replace capitalism. Social democracy does not replace capitalism, it modifies it. In many places, I see this confusion. Take, for example, this well-known senator in the United States, Bernie Sanders, and this whole group of left wing of the Democratic Party. They call them democratic socialists. They're not democratic socialists because they're not talking about replacing the American capitalist system. They talk usually in terms of better redistribution. But that's not going away from capitalism. So why do you call yourself socialists? You are social democrats. So Bernie Sanders and his followers, in my judgment, are social democrats in the European sense, not democratic socialists. Of course, it's a delicate balance to democratize the sphere of capital without quashing its dynamism. And what about data on innovations? So for example, if you look at the WIPO data, WIPO is the World Intellectual Property Office. They, in collaboration with Cornell University, publish a ranking of countries in terms of global global ranking of countries in terms of innovation. If you look that up, you will see United States is, of course, quite in top, but equally on top, sometimes even above the United States, are the social democratic countries, Germany and Scandinavian social democracies. So it is not that by following social democracy, you are giving up on the dynamism of capitalism. Those countries are keeping the dynamism of capitalism, and yet they are labor friendly. And that's the thing I want to emphasize, because I find in these debates, they get much too polarized. And we have to look at these examples that we have. I'm almost done. Much too often in the US and India, there is an attitude among businessmen to consider labor mainly as a disposable cost factor, and in the context of their low bargaining power, to squeeze the maximum out of labor. Ultimately, this hurts both capital and labor. If you read this very nice book by Robert Solow, it's called Labor Market as a Social Institution. I think this is a set of his lectures, 1990. Solow says, economists have a tendency to look at the labor market as any other market, demand, supply. But he says, labor market is not like your vegetable market. Labor market is essentially a social institution. So in that, you have to think of ways in which you help labor may also help capital. So we have to think about this, and that's what I call one of the contributions of social democracy. And this is my last slide. One hopes that it may be possible to persuade some sections of the business world that negotiating and co-managing job stability, training programs of workers with labor organizations, social democratic improvements in workers' voice, which I just now discussed, social insurance, morale, and urge to share workplace ideas. I'm talking about the Toyota system, for example, of improving productivity in collaboration between workers and managers. All this may not conflict with the long-term interests of capital in productivity and profits, and that it is possible, just going back to Marx, it is possible to save capitalism from myopic capitalists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pranab, for that helicopter tour of the landscape and, making us rethink some of the issues of the position of labor in today's global economy. At this point, we welcome questions from the audience. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. There's a microphone which will get to you. Introduce yourself in a sentence or two, your name, your affiliation, and please try to keep your question brief and to the point. And at some point, we'll also get questions from our Zoom audience, which I believe is sizable, so that Nikita will channel those questions. But let's start by taking questions from the live audience. Any question?
I wanted to ask you, how do you tackle something like AI's impact on labor as AI stands today? It's just mushrooming and it's growing every day. How do governments tackle something as big as this today? I know it's a very big question, but
I did touch on AI from the point of view of labor, and that because that's what my topic today. And I essentially mentioned how labor, if it gets a voice in the corporate governing bodies, as I gave the example of Germany, etc., then you can influence. Is AI going to gobble all the jobs? Or in which direction you can direct it? And the people in my acquaintance circle who's worked most on the kind of questions you are asking, you should read quite a few articles and now a book by Daron Acemoglu. I referred to his book, Power and Progress. And there, it is concentrated on primarily on artificial intelligence, and but essentially how throughout history technological progress have gone in one direction rather than another, has been influenced politically. It's not that they just technology falls from the sky and you have to take it. If it kills jobs, you have to take it. No, you have to assume that you can influence this. And that's very important for us. Artificial intelligence, unfortunately, is much bigger, and it can, some people think it has potential of great deal of benefit for humanity, particularly in medical and other aspects, but it has potentially great deal of destruction of humanity. But those are very large issues. I know very little on that. But my focus is on how can labor control AI. It is possible.
Thanks, Professor, for wonderful lecture. In the beginning of your lecture, you were talking about the crucial role of labor market or trade union for overall development. So in that context, how do you analyze the role of public sector units, especially, and also in the context of profit maximizing behavior of private sector? So how do you analyze the role of shrinking space for public sector units in today's context, especially in India?
Somehow, I do not believe it's just a simple public-private distinction. I was giving you an example from how it is possible to influence private sector behavior in terms of maximization of profits, which will ultimately help the private sector itself. One of the points that came repeatedly is that things that I'm talking about will help labor, of course, but ultimately in the long run, it will also help capital. So even private sector capital will benefit. That was my focus. I don't want to focus too much on public and private because it depends very much. There are very successful public sectors, enterprises all over the world. In France, in Singapore, in South Korea, I could give you many examples of successful private firms. I can give you many examples of successful public firms. I could give you many examples of very badly behaving, badly working public sector. So it depends on the management, it depends on the incentive structure. Public sector, you can incentivize. Public sector that's not working well, you can do an incentive reform. In fact, one of my friends, late Jean-Jacques Lafont, written books on it. How the French public sector, if you change the incentive structure, you can even make the public sector perform better. So it depends, it's not just who owns, public or private. I think it's a lot of these other things of which the incentive structure is one important aspect.
Yes, yes.
Hello. Thank you very much, Professor Bardhan. I am very much impressed by your concepts, but I have got my great doubts about the practicality of these concepts in India. I'm not trying to sort of interfere in your concepts, but what I find on the ground is something entirely different. I invite your attention to take a simple case of Maruti Suzuki. Technological disruptions and capital concentration and government policies all are totally against labor. Labor has just no say. Wage, you see, settlement, increments, leave, working conditions, health conditions, safety conditions, everything is just to see left to a sort of fate. Just by a simple threat that if you don't agree, I will shift my plant to Gujarat or Bengal. These, you see, things are still happening just like in colonial days. And privatization. Even government departments, 70% work has been privatized with contractors. Technology is reducing manpower. Today, trade unions have become zero. They have just no
Sorry,
role. They are
may I
no.
interrupt? Could you please come to your question?
Yes,
We have
and my
limited time.
question is, can you think of having to implement these concepts in India in any form?
I think I agree with you on the question that these are very difficult to implement. At the same time, there are ways people are doing it elsewhere. We are not different from people elsewhere. We are not just thinking about these things. Unfortunately, even our trade unions, many of the issues that I raised, even our trade unions don't give much thought to it. So forget about those who are hurting laborers, but even our labor leaders are not giving enough thought. So that's why my purpose was essentially to give some ideas of thoughts which may influence the leaders' views, and only then, I'm not that hopeful, but I always, faced with such questions, I always quote Antonio Gramsci. You will see this in his prison notebooks. He was in the prison of Benito Mussolini, and he writes that I have the optimism of the will, but the pessimism of the intellect. So intellectually, I know things are quite dark, but when I'm thinking of what can be done, we can think of optimism of the will.
We have questions from this webinar. So there's a question by Saikat Ghosh. He asks, labor councils in Germany function well where labor laws are well defined and enforced, but people are aware of their rights. In a setting like India, do you think a labor council would be feasible?
Not at the moment, but how many trade union leaders even know about Works Council in Germany? How many, even of those who know, how many have given thought? So all my purpose is to stimulate thought. Yes, at the current position, you cannot have immediately works councils in India, but I'm just saying it is possible to do these things. These are not wild things. These are being done, and empirically it has been shown this has good effects. Now, I know who will oppose immediately. Business will oppose corporate representation in governance. But German business have gradually accepted this. That is actually ultimately helps them as well. So repeatedly I'm pointing this, things that help labor can help capital. So I'm actually appealing to both capital and labor. Capital to be more long-sighted, not short-run profit maximization. Long-run profit, I'm not against profit maximization. I'm not against capitalism that is not myopic. So my appeal is to capital, but also to labor, because I find labor leaders primarily emphasize, how can I improve my salary? How can I improve my wage conditions? I'm just saying there are other larger issues. Corporate governance is only one, but there are other larger issues. How do you affect? It's no use saying that we have to stop this innovation, just as some trade unions were against computers. 1980s, against computers, which is silly. Instead, try to influence the nature of innovations that are not that are labor friendly, and that is, it's not always easy to do, but it is possible to do. That's all I'm saying. I'm trying to expand the horizon of labor leaders as well as capital leaders of capital.
We have one more question from the webinar. This is from Jean Rez. He asks, why not democratic socialism and not just social democracy? I guess he means, why not democratic socialism and just social democracy?
Is this Jean Tres? Okay. Jean, let me say hello to you. If you can get socialism, Jean, get it. But unfortunately, in India, or for that matter in many other countries, non-capitalist forms of enterprise have not shown, non-capitalist forms in the sense of socialism, not social democracy. I've given you examples that social democratic countries done well in terms of innovations. I have not seen that many examples at a continuing level of innovations done by non-capitalist forms of enterprise. If that happens, I need evidence. How many, India, forget in India. In India, even, even the left parties, I used to argue with the left parties in West Bengal that you are always downgrading capitalism. Give me one example of a successful non-capitalist enterprise that you have done. Then I'll be persuaded. So I need more evidence of innovative, productive farms which are non-capitalist. I'm not saying it's not possible. It is possible. But I have not seen that many examples. But social democracy, I've seen examples, and I've cited some examples. So my argument is not, I'm not against socialism. I'm just saying I need more evidence of productive, innovative behavior of non-capitalist firms. If there's enough evidence, I will go with you, Jean, in supporting socialism.
Hello, sir. My name is Raj Mang. I'm a second year student at Delhi School of Economics. I wanted to ask about what should be the way to this including of universal basic income. Should it be like continuing with social security schemes which have been implemented, or scrapping all those social security schemes and continuing only with the universal basic income? Thank you.
I told you that when I first talked about universal basic income in a meeting in Delhi, November 1990, I must tell you that Jean Drèze, my friend Jean Drèze, was also in that meeting. Jean and Aruna Roy was in the meeting. They at first thought that I'm thinking of replacing the existing welfare measures. Jean and Aruna Roy have been so effective in getting these programs of NREGA and as well as the Food Security Act. I've always been a strong supporter of those. So they thought I'm suggesting universal basic income as a replacement. No. Why would I then? I told you, where am I getting the money? The money that I'm getting for universal basic income is not by replacing those. In addition to those. In addition, if you can get 10% of GDP and spend 10% of GDP equally in health, education, infrastructure, and universal basic income, so you get 2.5% of GDP in universal basic income, and you can get not a big universal basic income, but you can get a decent basic income supplement. It is possible, but not replacing any of these programs. If you can replace some wasteful programs, then that will add to it. But I did not consider replacement of those. So I think those who are worried about replacing existing programs, they don't need any worry from me, because I'm not suggesting that.
Hello, sir. I'm Shes Kumar, a first-year economics student, and my question for you is that, seeing the current market conditions where there is a hiring freeze all over the world in many industries, how can countries and how can policymakers implement universal basic income when many firms don't even have enough funds or enough vacancies to even give their employees a very basic income which is related to that position or that vacancy?
I already told you that I've given a scheme for how to fund universal basic income. 3 sources I've suggested. One is restructuring existing subsidies which go to better off people. I think Sudipto and co-author, Sudipta Mandal and co-author have estimated their article in EPW 2019 that it's nearly 6% of GDP that go as what they call non-merit subsidies. So if you take that, almost 6% of GDP, in addition, if you look at the budget, how much in terms of tax exemptions and other, what they call revenues foregone, it's another 6% or so. So some of it is necessary, but I just said take 1/3 of that. So that's 2%, 6 plus 2, 8% of GDP. And then I say the other 2% is from additional taxation of capital. I already talked about wealth tax, which is 0 in India, inheritance tax is 0 in India, and capital gains tax is lower than in the United States. And a few other taxes, another 2% of GDP, add up to 10% of GDP. That's where the money, if you want to, political will may not be there, but if you want to, you can raise 10% of GDP, then you can spend 1/4 of that in universal basic income, 3/4 in health, education, and infrastructure.
If there are no more questions, there's one last one from the webinar. This is with regards to your comments on universal healthcare. And the question is, what lessons are in sight for us from the challenges that we've seen in sustaining universal healthcare systems like the NHS in the UK?
As I said in my lecture, you don't have to even go to, NHS is right now having problems, but partly because they're not putting enough money on it. France has a national, Germany has a different system, but I'm not looking at them. I'm looking at developing countries. There are cases of successful universal healthcare. Costa Rica has a long-standing program of universal healthcare. They have managed to do it. Thailand, I think around 2003 or so, they introduced universal basic income. It's going on. There are problems, but reasonably well. So look at these surrounding, even developing countries where they have done it, and learn from them. It's not very easy, but there are lots of problems of Ayushman Bharat. There's lots of problems with the private healthcare, that insurance healthcare that United States has. Unfortunately, we are going more to the disastrous United States healthcare program than trying to do even what countries like Thailand have done. So it is possible. It's not easy. There are a lot of incentive issues that arise in the beginning, but it requires a lot of political determination to go for universal healthcare. There are a lot of lobbies which work against universal healthcare, and so that's why it's the political determination which becomes very important. Even UK could not do it unless it was just after the Second World War, where a lot of big changes came. And NHS, by the way, in spite of all the problems, long waits, etc., is still, the majority will not give up on NHS. Even in the public opinion, look at the public opinion, NHS with all its problems is still, if there is enough money devoted to it, then the public don't want to give up. In the United States, which is private healthcare insurance, even there, the little extension that happened under Barack Obama, which is now called Obamacare, even the Republicans don't want to give up on it anymore. So once people realize the benefits, it's not that, so the thing is to start it. And starting it will persuade people about its benefits. Otherwise, people don't know what it is, and therefore we are uncertain.
Okay, we are really out of time, so let us wrap this up. Please join me in thanking our speaker, Professor Bardhan, for, I think, what all of you will agree was an exhilarating and engaging discussion and a look at the whole issue of the place of labor in today's globalized economy. Thank you very much, Pranab.